Welcome to the Joy Lab podcast, where we help you uncover and foster your most joyful self. Your hosts, Dr. Henry Emmons and Dr. Amy Prasek, bring you the ideal mix of soulful and scientifically sound tools to spark your joy, even when it feels dark. When you're ready to experiment with more joy, combine this podcast with the full Joy Lab program over at joylab.coach.
Hello, I'm Henry Emmons.
And I'm Amy Prasek. So welcome to Joy Lab. Here at Joy Lab, we focus on our elements of joy to help us uncover our most joyful life. So in this episode, we're playing around with the element of hope, the science of hope, the healing power of hope, realistic strategies to boost hope in our own lives. And we also talked about hope in our episode 2. So if you want like a double dose of hope, you can head over to that episode after this one. But before we dig in, I want to settle us in with some wisdom from one of my favorite writers, Barbara Kingsolver. She says, the very least you can do in your life is figure out what you hope for. And the most you can do is live inside that hope, not admire it from a distance, but live right in it, under its roof. All right, so let's start building this house of hope. Let's first maybe get a definition of hope to lay the foundation. So Dr. Charles Snyder, one of like the key hope researchers, pioneer in the field, defined hope as the tendency to see desired goals as achievable and to approach those goals with an agency mindset. So that agency mindset, I think, is so important. It's sort of what gives hope its power, really, I think. And this can be, either self-agency or collective agency, but it's this idea that this belief that the goal can be achieved. And this agency also, I think, helps draw an important line here between optimism and hope. And it might be surprising, but I'm actually not an optimistic person. I'm more of what's called a defensive pessimist. And at the same time, I am super hopeful. Optimism is really a positive outlook without any good reason for it, absent of facts, which can be a really helpful perspective, but it can start to sort of get you into trouble when it's at odds with facts. So I want to just invite the pessimist to join us because optimism is different than hope. So you don't have to be an optimist to be a hopeful person. I really like Dr. Jacqueline Mattis, another brilliant leader in the science of hope, and she sums this up so well. She defines hope as optimism with a plan. I love that. It just highlights how grounded hope is in data and how we can kind of go about creating it. And with that sort of blueprint behind it, you can see how hope is a skill, just like all of the other elements of joy that we work with here at Joy Lab. But of course, there are obstacles. So we want to get into those. And then, of course, how we can overcome those obstacles to build that house of hope. And the main obstacle we want to get into today is a common mental mistake we make, which is called the illusion of separation. And we talked about this a bit in episode 2, more as it relates to the enemies of joy. But Henry, can you explain those quickly, and then we'll get into this illusion of separation?
Yeah, sure. So at Joy Lab, we have a hypothesis that joy is natural and accessible to everyone. Everyone. That includes me and you. But sometimes it's just not quite so easy to tap into because we all run into challenges that can make that difficult. So I see these 3 really common, very broad patterns that are obstacles, and I call these the enemies of joy. So let me just kind of go through those one at a time. The first is what I refer to as brain imbalance or toxicity, and I think this is really referring to our biology. Now, to a degree, our biology is beyond our control, because a good part of it is determined by 2 things that we cannot change: our DNA and our early childhood environment. So, the quality of parenting that we had, the sense of safety or security, or simply did we get our basic needs met? All of this sets a tone for our brain chemistry and our capacity for resilience, which stays with us more or less throughout our lives. But we do have some say here. We can't change our past, but we can heal from it. We can't change our DNA, at least not yet, but there is a lot more that influences our genes than we think. We're going to get into that a little bit more later in this episode. So the second enemy of joy then is what I refer to as an unsettled mind. Now, we actually spent quite a bit of time on this in previous episodes, but briefly, I like the way that Buddhist psychology describes it. Pain and loss are unavoidable. Everybody experiences them. But the degree to which they cause suffering depends mostly on our own minds and the thoughts or emotions that we create in reaction to pain or loss. In other words, the real source of suffering is our mental attachment, and it shows up in one of three common patterns: either grasping, trying to hold on to more to make ourselves feel like we are enough or we have enough, or aversion, where we try to push things away that we don't like or that feel badly to us. Or the third option is simple mindlessness, where we sort of shut down, we close ourselves off, or we just simply don't want to see things as they really are. What this all means is that we want things to be a certain way. When they are, we are happy, and when they aren't, we feel unhappy. We get attached to things being the way we want them to be, and our happiness seems to depend on it.
Yeah.
So the third enemy of joy then is what's called the illusion of separation. And this is the belief that we are separate beings, that there is a boundary between me and you, or between me and the world around me. And that sounds true, doesn't it? But we hope to break that myth down in various ways during this episode.
Yeah, it sounds so true. We're trained to sort of think that way. And I know that when I've been caught by hopelessness, I've separated myself. I've put myself in a vacuum. I've told myself that it's just me in here. It's all terrible, and nobody else either feels this way or can, offer me any help. And we'll get into that tendency in a moment. I'm on this island of suffering. But first, I want to actually take a quick trip to the 17th century or so and talk about how we got ourselves more into this illusion. I think it's helpful, or at least how this illusion made its way into health and medicine. So you may be familiar with the philosopher Rene Descartes and his idea of the mind and body being totally distinct things, what became known as mind-body dualism or Cartesian dualism. So my perspective was that he was trying to prove that the soul exists separate from the body. And with that separation, he could mathematically prove the existence of the soul, which I think is great. But what got pulled out of his work, and I don't think it was what Descartes was actually arguing for, was that human health was only limited to, an individual's physical body, what was observable and measurable. And also that our health was mostly independent of anything outside of it. Descartes also used the words mind and soul pretty interchangeably, which made much of mental health kind of like caught in the middle, I think, or at best it was caught in the middle. And this perspective was a really big deal. This distinction was a really big deal for physicians and scientists at the time, because prior to this, the body didn't have that clear distinction from the soul. And so when the separation was proposed, the physical body, that separation sort of turned the body over to science. The body became outside of the domain of spirit, of religion, which freed physicians and scientists up to start testing on the physical body more, dissection, autopsy. So you can see, like how huge the advances were from that perspective. The advantages for medical science, folks actually got to see sort of these inner workings of the body, but at the same time, how that dualism, the separation, led to terrible ideas about illness, disease, and treatments. And I would say particularly for mental health and any stress-related conditions.
Right. I agree with you on that. It's an interesting side note that this hugely influential idea, which has shaped medicine, religion, philosophy, even politics for 4 centuries, it started out simply as a thought.
Right.
It was probably even a well-meaning thought. But if ever there was a doubt about the power of thought to shape the world, I think this is a great example that should dispel that.
Yeah.
But back to your point, yes, I think it's had a huge impact on mental health. The history of psychiatry is kind of a lesson in mind-body separation. From my view, at least, the field has gone from one extreme to another, almost yo-yoing back and forth from the idea that it's all biological to the thought that it's all in your head, or worse yet, that it represents some kind of moral failing or even punishment if you struggle with mental illness. Now, Freud, who everybody knows was hugely influential in psychiatry, he started out as a neurologist. He wasn't a psychiatrist. That didn't really even exist yet, but he believed that we would one day discover that all mental illness has a biological cause. But the science wasn't there yet, so Freud developed all of these theories, which were just theories. And he got off on some pretty wild tangents that endured for a long time. Now, mostly, his theories laid the blame on your subconscious, like repressed emotions and desires. And later on, from other contributors, parents got most of the blame, especially mothers. And that was really still in vogue, even when I was in my training. Hopefully it's not so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And then I remember when I was a resident and early in my career, the 1990s were billed as the decade of the brain, which was kind of a lofty goal that through neuroscience research, all of the root biological causes for mental illnesses would be discovered. And there was a lot of excitement at the time. We had new treatments like Prozac and Zoloft, drugs that at the time initially seemed to help with almost everything. Now we have realized that they have their limitations, but we're still kind of stuck in the thinking that it's all about brain chemistry. So just keep trying until you find the right medications. Over and over again, it seems that we get caught in this belief that we are not only separate from each other, but even within us, inside of us, there are these divided parts of ourselves that seem to be almost at war with one another.
Yeah. Let's get into those perceived divisions, right? And the illusion of separation. So to really myth bust this, we're going to break this separation down into 4 separate myths. See how our brain loves to divide. Couldn't help ourselves. But this will help us, though, so we can really connect to how we get tripped up into this illusion. So these 4 myths are the separation of mind and body, head and heart, nature and nurture, and inside and outside. And, here's the good thing also about identifying these 4 areas. You don't have to agree with all of them. Even resonating with one can really open the door to more hope. So our first separation is that of mind and body. I think we've covered this a bit already, but maybe the last thing I'll say here is that what I find so funny is that when this sort of warped take on mind-body dualism took over in science and medicine, like some of the most important, monumental scientific findings after that period have identified how much the thinking mind and the unseen, unmeasurable things in our world impact our health. And when it comes to mind and body, science just keeps finding that, hey, I guess the mind is pretty powerful and we are certainly more interconnected than we thought.
Gosh, isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
I think that's why I was so drawn to mind-body medicine early in my career. People were really just starting to realize that our thoughts had a direct impact on our bodies and vice versa.
Mm.
And that was just really appealing to me. I have always thought that we are more complex and unified beings than the disease model suggests. And eventually, I think science started to catch up to that.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things to me was how it brought together the head and the heart. Now, I'd like to think that most people who go into healthcare have big hearts. We see illness and suffering and we want to help. We want to be empathic, to be good listeners, to be compassionate. But by the end of medical training, I think a lot of people are finding it hard to keep their heart alive.
Mm.
I hope that's getting better, but there's still so much information just to digest and technical skills to develop during training that a lot of the heart-based skills, I think, get short shrift. And if you believe the numbers that show up in a bunch of recent surveys, we should be quite concerned right now about burnout in healthcare professionals of all types. And what are the signs of burnout? Fatigue, lack of interest, loss of empathy, impatience, irritability, all signs to me that the head has been disconnected from the heart. One of the things that has always kept my heart alive is to be moved by people's stories. And when you're under constant time pressure, it's hard to even listen to a person's story, much less let yourself be moved by it. So, what happens to the brain when we really hear somebody's story? When brain activity is measured, the entire brain lights up. Storytelling or receiving stories, it's one of the only human activities that lights up the entire brain. I think all it takes is a little time and enough presence and attention. And then we can have this great experience of really feeling fully alive. And that's what I think happens when head and heart come together. I've heard this referred to as wholeheartedness, and I just think it's one of the best feelings that a person can have.
I think, we certainly all want that. And I think folks are probably resonating with burnout right now, no matter what field you might be in, or if you're working, no matter what you're doing. And I love also the idea of listening as like one of the richest fuels for the head and heart. And those two things, actually, burnout and listening, there's like something specific there that I'm thinking about. I hope this won't take us on a huge tangent. I hope it'll be helpful. But I think today we're asked or expected to listen too much, maybe. 50 years ago, it's pretty much like Walter Cronkite, given the news, everybody's listening. But in the last 1 to 2 decades, which is just a tiny sliver of our human existence, we've had to massively transform the way we listen. We've been soaked in media with the expectation, I think, that you should be in the know and like have a fixed opinion on all of it. And on top of that, so much of the messaging, we talk about this a lot, that comes to us is fear-based and it's divisive. So I think we have to almost close our heart to stand in the path of that much unsettling media. Like we have to desensitize, we have to kind of numb our heart, listen through all these filters in our head so that we can keep up, appear to be on top of things, and like have this firm opinion. So I guess my question here is, besides sort of, probably getting out of the path of that fire hose as much as possible, how can we realistically re-engage our heart to listen amidst what might be sort of this unconscious split and sort of degradation of our listening skills?
Well, I'm not one to say, live with your head in the sand, but I do think that there are times where taking a break from it might be the best we can do.
Mm.
But if you're really trying to stay engaged, stay in the flow of things and keep your heart alive, I don't think there's any substitute for time, for trying to use time as an ally to give yourself opportunities to turn inward, to kind of center and focus. And this actually kind of leads us into one of our other areas of concern here, the or separation, the inner and the outer worlds, inside and outside. And I think that most of us, whether we know it or not, that what we're really looking for in our lives is greater openness and connection.
Yeah.
And I think that when we don't have that feeling, it's really easy to get discouraged, stressed out, kind of unmoored, not have hope really for the future. And so the inside and the outside, I think, need to both be honored and brought together more. And my way of thinking about that is that we really need to be more permeable.
Yeah.
We need to be more vulnerable in a sense, where we can allow things in and not be overwhelmed by them, but take them in and really kind of take down some of the walls of separation that we have created as a means of protecting ourselves. Sometimes rightly so, necessary to do. But it's that constant battle almost between these two parts of ourselves, the one that wants to be open and connected and free to be part of the world in a totally engaged way, and the other that feels this need, driven out of fear mostly, this need to put up boundaries, walls, to separate ourselves, to keep ourselves safe. And I think that's a very complicated way of talking about this relationship that we have now with news and social media and so forth. But I think that in order for us to not only survive it, but to thrive in the face of what's going on today, we have to keep intentionally turning inward and working on creating that openness and permeability.
You actually reminded me of I had a mentor that always said to me, read as much spiritual text as you do the news. Well, we are going to dive into inside outside, that separation a bit here. But first, I think I would rather solve the nature versus nurture debate quickly. So let's do that. There are some clear outliers here that we're not talking about necessarily severe genetic disorders that are fairly cut and dry. It's generally not what we argue with or about when it comes to nature versus nurture anyway. But Henry, how do you see this separation of nature and nurture as an illusion?
Well, I have a very personal take on this, and if it's all right, I'll get into that a little bit.
Yeah.
So I was adopted, and like most adoptees that I know, my feelings toward this were complicated. I always felt a little different from the rest of my family that I grew up with. I loved them. I just felt as though I wasn't as much like them as my friends seemed to be like their families. Now, I suppressed any interest in finding my birth family, mostly out of loyalty to my adoptive parents. And I remember even in college writing a paper on this topic, nature versus nurture, where I came down really strongly on the nurture side of things. And I think, again, largely out of loyalty. And then when our first son was born, when I was 30 years old, I suddenly got really curious about my birth parents. And so I started a search for them, and it ended up meeting both of them. They never were together, but I was able to find and meet with both of them. And it was very weird for me to see so many striking similarities between me and them. And it wasn't just in physical appearance and such, it was stuff you wouldn't really expect to be biological. So like my birth mother and I had both trained to become spiritual directors, which was really strange for people who grew up Lutheran, which we both did, because we just had no tradition in the Lutheran Church at that time of spiritual direction. And then when I met my birth father, I found out that he had taken a training to be a psychologist, actually to serve in the military. It was an accelerated program, and he didn't stay in the field, but still, I just thought, all right, this is just kind of weird. And then this is just a funny aside. When I met them separately, and they were several years apart, and both times I gave them the choice where to meet for our first meeting. And they both chose to meet at a Perkins restaurant. I thought, those might be the only two times I've been in a Perkins restaurant in the last 40 years. So here's my stance on nature versus nurture. And I just feel this is common sense. It is both of them working together, I think, in roughly equal measures. That's the way I read the epidemiology of mental health, by the way. According to the famous twin studies, virtually all mental illnesses are roughly 50% from genetics and 50% from other factors. Now, that 50% from genetics might not be in our control, but that leaves a lot that we might, in fact, be able to influence. And that's where I think our focus should be.
I find that so hopeful, putting focus into what we can control. I've said it before, the nature passed down to me is really jam-packed with mental illness, like serious mental illness. So that is part of my blueprint. And for me, that 50% really took hold. But that's not the end of the story, as we're saying. We can engage in these joy-boosting practice to dampen that impact. We can embrace our mind-body connection and change the experiences or the expression of the disease or what's being seen as a dysfunction. And I actually got into this possibility, sort of breaking free of our genetics, through a winding research drama that I read about when I was in my first grad class, which was called psychoneuroimmunology. It was taught by this brilliant, feisty nun who was just so inspiring. But it was sort of like a crime story for research nerds. It had to do with Dr. Paul Kammerer's research with midwife toads in the early 1900s. I'll summarize it super quick, but this is such an interesting saga. So I'll put a link in the show notes for others who are curious. So Dr. Kammerer was curious what, if any, changes would take place when he forced a midwife toad to essentially mate in water. And these are land-loving toads, so that was like not a normal behavior for them. And at the time, the hypothesis would be that the toads would, die off. They can't possibly change their whole reproductive behavior processes quick enough to, survive a few generations or something. But they did. Within 2 generations, the male toads formed what they called nuptial pads on their little frog hands or paws. I'm not sure what frog hands are cold. But those pads enabled them to hold on to the female in this water environment so that they could successfully reproduce, which is like unbelievable for science at the time. Such a huge change for this toad so quickly. And so there's this whole drama that then happened, claiming Dr. Kammerer was a fraud, like just a sea of conspiracies and xenophobia and politics, and really just like disbelief of the finding as well. But, then really this whole idea was sort of rejected for the next 100 years. But fast forward to the 21st century, and we have, this understanding of epigenetics. So it's very likely that Kammerer's research was sound, or at least he was onto something, which means our DNA, as you said earlier, Henry, isn't so concrete, across generations, but even within the individual, within a generation, as we were just saying, those big changes can happen so that we are more resilient, so that we can thrive. Like that's our blueprint. And Henry, I absolutely love the way you talk about epigenetics. So can you say more here about how it really relates to our mental health?
Sure, but first let me thank you for teaching me about nuptial pads. I've never heard that term before.
I know, it's hysterical. I love it.
Yeah, so the way I understand epigenetics, and the term, by the way, the term epi means on top of. So it's kind of like there's this layer of something on top of our genes or our DNA that actually has a lot of say in what our genes do. So very simply put, DNA is like a blueprint. It gives instructions to the workers in the cells to produce the enzymes and proteins and the stuff they need to run their important jobs. So it's very much like a set of instructions. But whether those instructions make it into the cell and are brought to life, are manifested, depends on a lot of other stuff that is kind of outside but surrounding the DNA itself. And it's like a series of gateways that can be open and shut, if you will. And so if you imagine the instructions having to go through this set of passages before it gets manifest. Well, there are a lot of things that influence that opening or closing, or the turning on or turning off of the genetic information. And so we might have certain genes that make us more vulnerable, let's say, to depression or certain forms of anxiety or other mental illness. We might have those genes, but they may never get activated because we haven't run into the circumstances that do that. And I think that explains a lot of why identical twins, one twin might have an illness and the other doesn't. If it was all genetics, they'd both get it, or they both would be free of it. But that's where the research says, no, it's only about 50%. So there are all these other layers of influences that we can do something about. We can have some say in it. Now, a lot of this actually may have to do with nutrition, our nutritional status, and what sort of information we're getting into our bodies through the foods that we eat. It may also have a lot to do with the amount and the type of stresses that we encounter. And stress, this is largely about survival. So some of the stresses are, do we even have enough food to eat? That's a hugely stressful thing if blood sugar gets too low. And that kind of thing we've been learning recently can be passed through like 2 or 3 generations very quickly if our ancestors, our near ancestors, went through a drought or a famine, then that changed their bodies and their expression of their genes, and that can get passed along for a couple of generations at least. And so there are all these different influences that we would be wise to learn about or pay attention to, even if you've had an illness that's been there for a long time, there may be things you can do to, in a sense, deactivate, turn off that illness gene so that's just not so prevalent, not such a big part of your life.
I just think it's so freeing. Like, we can create nuptial pads all over. we have that much power. Yeah, the science of epigenetics is really freeing. I think, to me, it speaks to, that hope and resilience really are written into our DNA. All right, so let's shift into our last illusion, which is inside versus outside, which we just kind of like teased about earlier. Here's what I'm thinking. I think it can be really easy to fall into this illusion that it's, either solely ourselves or solely our environment that's the cause and solution when depression or anxiety hits. I think, as we've dug into with these other illusions of separation, in like 99% of cases, neither of those are 100% true. It's not one or the other, right? The evidence is just so clear here. We are social creatures living in a shared environment, and we are all impacted by what's happening within us and around us. But I think holding that can be really hard. What if you can't control something about your outer environment and it's crushing your mental health? And so I think my question for you, Henry, is how can we find hope for healing sort of in that space between inside and outside, particularly when something external is causing a lot of distress and we can't change it?
Right. So I want to be sensitive here, because I think that people often get the message that if they only thought about things differently or had a healthier perspective on what's going on in their lives, that they wouldn't feel so badly. They
Right.
wouldn't react so strongly to things. It's a little bit of the same idea that, we're causing our own problems, that sort of notion. Yeah. And I just don't really feel that way. I feel that each one of us at this point in time are doing the best that we can with where we're at to deal with all the stuff that we have to deal with. So I really don't think that we want to think about it that we just need to try harder or do better or get, a better perspective on things. But at the same time, I really am a believer that how we think and respond to things makes a very big difference in how much it bothers us, how much it affects us, and how long. So there is this dance that I think we have to always be doing and just try and get more skilled at between, is this what's happening outside in my external life, is that really the problem? Or is it me in the sense of how I'm thinking and responding to it? Now, I think that what a lot of people do with that question is they think, well, it's me because I'm somehow not good enough, or I'm not sufficient enough, that there's something about me that's flawed or imperfect, and that's the problem. That's really not true in my view. I think that any one of us at any time can get better at how skillfully we respond to things. But that's different than saying this is my fault, I screwed up, I'm a bad person, wherever we go with that. Now, I also believe that our thoughts and our response are super important, but that's not the whole of it. So that doing this inner work, which to me is really about creating greater awareness and attention and connection, and really connecting not just with other people, that's part of it, but also connecting with this deeper, more healthy, more grounded part of myself, and also this part of myself that is more, let's say, more soulful or more spiritual or connected with something that is beyond myself. So I really think that if we can put a little bit of attention and time and focus on just trying to become more present and more open, and more connected, that a lot of these things that we view as problems just tend to fall away without a ton of effort on our part. It's almost about, by doing the inner work and paying greater attention to our lives, that these things that we feel are such big problems fall away on their own without a lot of effort on our parts.
Well, I love first this idea of that organic release, and like hope grows from that space. And then I'm also thinking about these practices of awareness, and I can't help but thinking of our experiments at Joy Lab, where we loosen the grip of thought, and then we apply mindfulness for change, and then this dialogue with the soul. It's all of these. We're just moving in those spaces of inside, outside, heart and mind, and so that is a great spot as well to really practice with us, to join us in the program. But I want to end, I think, our chat like channeling that grounded, connected, hopeful energy as much as possible as we really kind of reject this illusion of separation. And there's actually, Henry, a short excerpt from one of your books, The Chemistry of Calm, that I think does that. But maybe you can expand on it a bit. So this chapter that this little excerpt comes from is actually called The Science of Hope. So I'm just going to read these few sentences. My experience has shown that even if you have had a lifetime of struggle, healing is still possible. The chronic effects of stress are potentially reversible. I have seen many people reclaim a degree of resilience that they had no longer thought possible. Is there anything else with that, Henry, that you'd like to kind of send us away with here?
Yeah, I drew a lot of inspiration from a very early experience in my career where I did some training with John Kabat-Zinn and Saki Santorelli, learning to do mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I remember very clearly them saying during the training, as long as you are still breathing, there is a chance for you to come into the present moment, to be healed, something to that effect. And I think that we forget how natural and how aligned all these forces are within us and around us to create healing. I think healing is a totally natural, built-in mechanism that we always have access to, always, even if things are really, really hard. It might not happen in a moment's time, although it could. It might take time for full healing to occur, but I think that opportunity to turn toward it is there for us as long as we are living.
Mm. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us here for the Joy Lab podcast. I really hope that a door to hope has opened up for you. You don't even need to, build a big old house of hope right now. There's so much healing that can happen when just a little bit of light and air comes in from an open door, making space for that healing moment by moment, just as Henry said. And so that openness, actually, that healing that is available to us makes me think of the wisdom of hope that we all had when we were little, likely before adulting, or the fire hose of media buried it a bit, which makes me want to end with some insight from Shel Silverstein. So here it is. Listen to the mustn'ts, child. Listen to the don'ts. Listen to the shouldn'ts, the impossibles, the won'ts. Listen to the never haves, then listen close to me. Anything can happen, child. anything can be.
Thank you for listening to the Joy Lab podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, visit joylab.coach to subscribe for your monthly infusion of joy and to learn more about the full Joy Lab program. Be sure to rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.